had a hard time getting a version that doesn't stop recording after 10 minutes, so I'm hoping it'll keep going for us. Okay, so back to our little PowerPoint here, right? XAML controls, even the basic ones, as we saw, there's quite a bit of power here in terms of setting the attributes and the properties, right? So you can have things like, linear gradient brushes and so on, just even something as simple as a text block. But, okay, the controls we want to focus on mostly, those are the basic controls, all the ones that are container controls, that they contain something else. Now there's two families or classes here of container controls in XAML. Content controls contain a single content object. So obvious one we've talked about before is the button, right? I gave the example that a button, its content could be anything we want. It could be a video file that's playing, the movie's playing on the button itself, things like that, right? So content objects are very powerful. Any kind of object you can create can fit on the as the content of the object itself, but you only get one. It's a single content object, right? Whereas most of our layout controls, the ones we use to control and give us a responsive design, will actually support a collection of objects. Specifically, they're UI element collection objects. They're often just called child objects, right? And so that is obviously far more effective for doing actual layout type of situations. And I typically use for that to help us give a responsive design and so on. So common ones are things like you've seen, the grid and stack panel, canvas. There's a whole bunch of others too that are these layout type controls themselves. So a lot of what we need to learn at the beginning is how to work with these different layout controls, because responsive design in Windows Presentation Foundation has been around a lot longer and was out there earlier than CSS that became popular to try and come up with a responsive design in web pages, right? So we might as well take advantage of what we have here. Okay. So grids are usually the first thing you see, right? But it's a little confusing because it's not like any grid you've probably used in other environments themselves. By default, there's at least one column and row inside a grid. So a grid is a single cell until you add anything more to it. Okay? But there is actually a default column and a default row. They're indexed from 0. So anything you just throw on the grid, you're throwing it all really in one cell, right, if you don't define anything else. But what gets a little weird then is how do you define rows and columns? It's not like our TR and TH tags and things like that in HTML. We actually give row.definitions collection, right, and row.columns, a collection of columns. Okay? So each one has different properties. So example, you might set height properties and width properties and things like that. So you define how many columns and what their properties are going to be first. Then you start adding elements to the grid, and as you do so, you say, okay, which cell, basically, which column and which row are you going to be in? So it's very free form in that, as you add the elements, it doesn't matter what order you stick them in. That has no effect on where they show up. It's all about saying what column and what row of the grid they will actually appear, right? So it's a very different kind of an approach itself to working with the grid. So you'll have all your row definitions and column definitions usually at the top, if you need them at all. And then after that, you'll start listing the elements you actually want to appear inside your grid layout control, right? Now those height and width values, okay? As my previous slide showed, you could use actual pixels, right, to set heights and things like that. Another choice is the keyword auto. Auto, what that does is it will size to the content, right? So if you stick on a particular sized text block or button or something else, right, inside of that particular row or column, then the width or height will just adjust to the content that's contained inside it. And then the other one is the star. Star sizing basically means give me whatever's left over, right? Now with the star sizing, there's a twist on that. You can actually put a digit with the star to say basically I want such a proportion of the available space. So it's kind of like in Bootstrap where we've talked about our 12 columns, and I'm going to say this column takes up a width of 4 out of the 12, right, or 1/3 of the screen, right? It's kind of the same idea here. Whereas if we had, say, 3 rows and you had them star 1, star 2, and star 3 for the height, well, the topmost one, star 1, is asking for 1/6 overall of the height that's available, right? Things like that. And the star 3 height, well, that would ask for basically half of the available height to have for itself. So it's all proportional, which obviously, as you know from the responsive design you get from Bootstrap, this lends itself very, very well to screen sizes of all different resolutions and shapes and sizes and so on. Okay? So if I just go back, okay, to my actual code here that I have as an example, you can see, so this first row definition, this height is 100, that would be pixels. So it'll be a fixed height row, okay, and that's how big it is. The next one is auto, so that will, if there's nothing added in it, it'll shrink right down, okay? Depending on the size of the object we might put in that row, any cell in the row, and it will get a height sufficient to support it. And the third one is just a star, which means whatever's left over, okay, is the height of the third row in my grid. Right? Whereas this is showing the 1, 2, and 3 star approach, whereas it's saying, okay, we're going to divide the width into, in this case, 6. Okay, if I change the numbers, it'll just be whatever proportion I give it. Right? And divide it up in terms of the available space that way. So it's quite flexible in terms of how you define it, right? And we have all this ability to size it in different ways, right? So quite often you'll see that you'll have maybe fixed or auto widths, and then the last one is almost always a star, right? So give me whatever's left over, right? So if it gets wider, it just takes up whatever space there is. Now, of course, everything can also have margins. Margins are a little funny in that they actually are always expressed in pixels, right? Whereas everything else can use pixels or, some sort of relative sizing arrangement. But margins are usually pretty small anyway. They just get usually a bit of space around things, and they work exactly the same way as they do inside CSS, right? So there's no surprise there. You start, left, top, right, bottom, and the 4 digits that you give, and away you go. So the grid itself can have margins, right? It forces the grid to have a bit of space around it. That's one quick and dirty way sometimes to give a bit of, so controls aren't at the very edge, is moving the whole grid in a little bit by giving it a margin. Okay. The elements inside the grid put themselves, right, inside a particular row and column, right? So you basically say something like this inside the attributes of a given control or UI element. You say grid.row and grid.column. Now, if you don't say anything, it's still going to go into a row and a column, but it's going to be 0, 0, right? That's the default. Okay, remember we said already that you don't have to define any columns or rows, and you'll still have row 0 and grid column 0, right? So you have one cell. And often you'll see, programmers show off the fact that if you want it in the 0 indexed column or row, you just don't even mention it, and it's going to go there. Okay, I kind of sometimes like to put it in so I see explicitly where it's going, but it's really not required, and there you go, right? So it's 0 based as you reference columns and rows. There'll always be one default implicit cell, okay, 0, 0. And if not specified, anything you stick on there will go into that default cell. The other thing that you should be aware of course, you can do like column span type of things as well. So if you've got a big long text block you want to span across columns, you just can do the same kind of code. IntelliSense will even help you write it. The other thing about grids is they can allow elements to layer on top of each other. So if you're not careful, you can actually hide things you didn't mean to, right? So that's something you have to be aware of. Now, another very commonly used one is that stack panel. Basically, this is like a div, right? Very much like a div in CSS and HTML. There are 2 orientations available. Vertical is the default, or you can specify horizontal, and that's really all it does. One of the main differences between a stack panel and a grid is you can never have 2 things overlap, right? So it'll just stack them side by side or top down in that order, whatever order you actually put them inside the stack panel. So you can actually do the entire layout with nothing but stack panels, and actually I think the instructor that you listen to as you go through that textbook tutorial course I've given you, you'll find that he says most of the time that's all he uses are stack panels for layout, that he finds it better than grids. I like to use a grid at least for the main content control of the page, and then put stack panels inside. Okay, so this is vertical orientation by default, left to right flow by default. Of course, you can always change that and make it right to left instead of left to right, and so on. And of course, you're going to usually be having multiple layout controls, right? Because each stack panel, every element inside it could be another stack panel, and so on, right? Grids will overlap controls, and the stack panel will, as it says, stack them up, and that's all there is to it. So those are the most basic controls. I didn't even put a slide in for canvas. Canvas is another one you see talked about a lot. Canvas is like absolute positioning. If you want to absolutely put this one here and that one there, and then they don't change at all in their relative positions, you can just use a canvas instead. I would never use a canvas. You're kind of going against the responsive design, unless you're putting it in a particular spot. And you can, of course, canvas can be contained in one cell of a grid, right? And then you can use it that way to put particular things in a fixed arrangement to each other. But those are the most common. There are lots of others, but those are the most common controls you need to be aware of to start off with, right? Now there are some unique aspects that get more into more powerful responsive design that have just been added in the Windows 10 version of this, but I thought we'd just take it a step at a time and talk about this so far. Okay. One thing to note, the page itself is an example of a content control, right? So just like a button, it has one content object it can contain, not a family of them, not a child, but of course that one content object itself can be a layout control with its own hierarchy. So you do have the possibility of having that whole multi-generational hierarchy of controls. Just be aware that in the page itself you get an error if you try to put two grids right inside the page. Right? You can have one grid or one stack panel, but of course inside those you can have as many as you want down multiple layers of generational hierarchy. All right. That's it for now in terms of those controls. So, I should have probably given you that material earlier, but I really suggest, and I'm going to even play one of these. Okay, I'm just going to stop.